Welcome to presentation 13 in looking at the book of Leviticus. As usual, let's just look back for a moment or two in the previous presentation. Here we focused on Bible verses that simply didn't make much sense to us, difficult to understand. We looked at this dangerous idea of blasphemy, the draconian punishments that were applied from time to time, and an eye for an eye, and asked the question, was this the basis for justice? Critics of the Bible very quickly jump on these ideas. Blasphemy, what kind of God takes offense in this way? And what kind of God demands the kind of brutal death that sometimes seems to occur in the Old Testament? Three basic ideas. Part of the problem is language has changed, meanings have changed. Blasphemy today usually means that. But in the biblical era it didn't mean that at all. It meant defiant rebellion. So the word has changed its meaning. Punishment and justice. In the modern era, we base it on imprisonment, people being removed from society for a period of time. That didn't happen in the biblical era. Things were in small groups, and revenge and retaliation were the norm. Utterly inhumane. We've got to see the punishments in the context and the light of the culture of that time. And people have looked at this, have realized that the principles laid down in books like Leviticus are way ahead, well ahead of the cultural norms of the people groups of that time. So we have to be careful in interpretation. There's a fundamental principle. Blasphemy. There is no place amongst God's people for those who are working actively against God by ascribing God's work to the devil. That's how Jesus interpreted it. And of course we would never enforce draconian punishments. They have got to be seen in terms of the culture and context of the time. But the principle still applies. And that's the only meaning of blasphemy in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Very different from today. Another fundamental principle comes out of things. When it comes to justice and punishment, the ideas of revenge and retaliation, these are rejected. They were the norm in the cultures of that time. But Leviticus lays it down very clearly that there is a right and there is a wrong. And that justice means putting things right. It's a positive position to take. And there's much we can learn from that for society today. So we've got to take into account the meanings of words and the way they were understood. But we've also got to take into account the culture and situation and lifestyle when Leviticus was written. Now let's move on into chapter 25. A bit of background first. They were coming through the desert, and in due time they were entered their new homeland. When they got there, the land was allocated to family groups. You'll find that in the book of Joshua, not to individuals. Settlements were small villages. We get a bit deluded by the word city in the older Bible versions. They were just small communities. Farming was central to life. It was an agricultural community. Some parts were quite stony and barren, but much was very fertile. But the soil did need working. But compared to what they'd left in Egypt, compared to the desert experience in the Sinai Peninsula, yes, the land was indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. That's what they were heading towards. They'd come out of slavery, brutal slavery. They were entering a land where family groups were allocated land so that they could grow food and breed animals. They could build their homes, and they lived in small communities. That was the culture, that was the setting of the day. So in the land they would have food, shelter, and freedom. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. God had released them from slavery and brought them into a land of security. So that's what they were heading towards, and Leviticus 25 has to be seen in the context of that lifestyle. And this chapter offers some of the most enlightened social legislation for any society. It was light years ahead of what was going on in the cultures round about, indeed for centuries afterwards. And in many ways, it's ahead of our thinking today. Food, shelter, freedom, security. Now if you ponder that, that's what we all want, just at a human level, with our families to live. And every person had the inalienable right to family land. The land was given to family groups. Freedom to farm it. Freedom to use the crops obtained from it. In our modern society, we tend to have the two extremes, extreme capitalism at one end and extreme communism at the other. And of course, there's a whole gradation in between. Now, the problem with both of these models of society, that tends to accumulate all the wealth in the hands of the state. Now, in practice, it's in the hands of the ruling elite. And you can see that in the few communist countries today and the ones who've drifted backwards towards that way of organizing society. At the capitalism end, the danger is that it tends to leave most of the wealth in the hands of the few. Wealth accumulates. It's eye-watering, the bonuses that some people earn today. That in a one-year bonus, somebody can earn more than the majority of the population could earn in an entire lifetime. Several times more, and that's just a bonus for 1 year. That's obscene. Both of these have flaws when we take them to the extreme, and they are moving towards the extremes in society today. Now I want to look at Leviticus 25 in the context of that. Very different. First of all, the society was organized in what I've called sevens. The seventh day, the much needed break from the routine of hard work. Now studies have been done and it's shown that the human body works best, our minds work best, when we have a 1 day in 7 break. We were designed for it. The 7th year. Every 7 years the land fertility was to be restored. They didn't harvest a crop. The people enjoyed a year with work reduction. And there was increased provision for the poor, refugees and dispossessed during that time. And God said, if you follow that sequence, you'll have enough food. The year before will give you enough to keep you going. And it did. But it makes sound agricultural sense, but it makes sound psychological sense. And it looks after people. But then there's the 49th year, the seventh year. And at that time, all property was restored and all land was restored to the original owner. Because you see, that prevented the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. Now I'll explore that in a moment or two, exactly how that worked out. It's an interesting model. Now it addresses a fundamental problem. From time to time, all of us hit hard times. We lose a job in our modern day society. Or a key breadwinner is ill. Now in those days there was no welfare state, there was no provision. So if, for example, the family hit hard times by a very poor crop, and they hit hard times, or someone important in the family who could do the work took ill, the family hit hard times. What were they to do? Well, one way around it was to raise some money by selling some of their land. Now that solved the problem temporarily, maybe got them enough to keep them in food and keep them going till the next harvest could come. But if they sold some of their land, they had less land, therefore they had less crops in the future. So poverty grew. But somebody else got the land, wealth increased. But these raised money temporarily. Now the other thing is to sell someone of their family. So the man might sell himself into kind of service with another family. And he worked for them without being paid, and his work paid off his debts, perhaps to that other family. Or quite typically, they would sell off a daughter. Men were important because they worked with their physical strength, the hard grind of the agricultural round. But the daughter could be sold off to another family where she worked as a maid, unpaid. And her work paid off their debt. So their hard work raised the money. Now that's the ways they could deal with the problem at that time. But you see, if you sold your land, you lost the capacity to produce food. Poverty would grow. And if you sold yourself to another family or to another person, well, you weren't free anymore. And therefore you couldn't get out of the grind of poverty. Now this is the problem, and it's a problem of the societies of that time. But that was the net result. Now our societies today, particularly in the West, we don't work in quite that same way. But the net outcome is just the same. You can look at the figures as economists have done, and over time the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And society divides increasingly. And you can see it very markedly in some of the countries of the West. You can see it very markedly in the developing world. You can see it very markedly in countries like Russia. And you can see it very markedly in Islamic states, where ruling elites do very well, and the majority are just scraping a living. Equality has gone. Now that background, let's look at the chapter. We're going to go through not the whole chapter, it's a long chapter, but some of it fairly quickly. The Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, this must have been quite early in their journeys, Mount Sinai where the 10 Commandments were given. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards, and gather your crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourselves, your male and female servants, and the hired worker and temporary resident among you, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. Count 7 Sabbath years. That's 7 times 7 years. So that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then sound the trumpet everywhere on the 10th day of the month. On the Day of Atonement sound the trumpet throughout the land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property, to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow, do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines, for it is a jubilee, it is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. Now that outlines the broad principle. Doesn't touch the weekly Sabbath, which is given elsewhere, but the 7 years and the 49 years. Now let's move on to the next stretch. If you sell land to any of your people or buy land from them, Do not take advantage of each other. Now this is the context. Someone has hit hard times, needs to sell some land in order to make ends meet. Or you're in the position of buying the land to help them out. Do not take advantage of each other. Do not take advantage of each other is repeated, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. God doesn't take advantage of us. He only wants the best for us. We must reflect that. Follow my decrees. That's my boundary conditions. Be careful to obey my laws, the directions I've given, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit. You will eat your fill and live there in safety. Provision, security. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, says God, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. It's in sacred trust to you. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor, hits hard times, and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they've sold. Keep it in the family. If, however, there's no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it for themselves, they are to determine the value for the year since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. It comes back to them. They can then go back to their own property. But if they do not acquire the means to repay, what was sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. Now, if you ponder this for a minute, it's the basis of all fair trading. Exploitation is out. It also undermines all forms of gambling. Because if someone wins, others lose. You have taken advantage of them. There's a fundamental principle there, and we've lost it in the West. We're all looking for the quick fix, the good buy. And the land isn't theirs. It's been allocated in temporary ownership to family groups, not individuals, family groups. Now we think about all the possessions that we have today in the West. If we looked upon them as temporarily loaned to us by God, to be used by us for the benefit of others, our society would be totally transformed. That made sure that the land didn't accumulate in the hands of the wealthy. It was retained within family groups. Every 49 or 50 years, it went back to the original owners. Principle's interesting, principle's important. We can't quite do it the same way today, but it could underpin all our dealings. Moving on again. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so they can continue to live among them. Now notice, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger. Some of the things that are being put out about people trying to come to the West are pretty awful in the light of that. We are all human beings, and some of the people trying to come to the West are in great need and need our help. Do not take interest or any profit from them. That's interesting again. But fear your God, so they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money or at interest or sell them food at a profit. No exploitation. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. The reminder there was, you lot were slaves, and you know what was done to you. Don't put anyone else through anything anywhere like that. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, That was the other way to raise money. Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are for work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought up out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Now we have to watch the word slave. Come back to that in a moment or two. The word in the original language doesn't mean exactly the same as in English today. You may also buy some of the temporary residents among you and members of their clans born in your country. They become your property. Now that's closer to people going into service. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Right throughout many of the early books of the Old Testament, there's a continual revulsion against any form of brutal slavery. Because the people of Israel had been slaves. They'd been through it. They knew what it was like to be exploited and brutalized. And there's a revulsion against it. But the word slave can encompass many things other than that. And it can encompass people who are just working for you in your home or in your fields. So it's not quite the same as the modern use of the word. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. An uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them. Buy them out of it. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. They and their buyer are to count the time from the year they sold themselves up to the year of Jubilee. That's the 50th year. The price for their release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired worker for that number of years. If many years remain, they must pay their redemption a larger sale of the price paid for them. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they are to compute that and pay for the redemption accordingly. They are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. Even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. All the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants whom I brought up out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And again, we see this revulsion against any form of brutal slavery. The word slave can encompass servants, hired workers. That's permitted. But the exploitation of others, that's out. Now that's light years ahead of the cultures round about. Now let's look at this Jubilee principle. The word is mentioned 14 times in the chapter. It's kind of important. Now there was the 7 days, every 7th day. Now that comes from Exodus. We're familiar with the statement. But notice the bit at the end. Rest, refreshment. We human beings need the break. We can't work round the clock day after day endlessly. Our efficiency diminishes. Our health is affected. God designed us, and we need to take that break. But there's also the 7 years here. The land was left fallow 1 year and 7. Allowed it to be restored. And then there's the 7 times 7, the 49 years, once a lifetime. All land reverted to the original owner. Now somehow in our cultures today we've got to get some system, And it won't be this system because our culture is different today. We're not in an agricultural culture. But we've got to have some system that stops the rich getting richer at the expense of the majority. And if you'd sold yourself to pay off debts, I've used the word slavery, but it's probably nearer service, you got your freedom. Remember, if a man, because the man was the head of the house at that time, he incurred a major debt, hit hard times, he could either sell his land, sell his freedom by working for somebody else, or sell a member of his family, usually a daughter. What the 50-year Jubilee system, it prevented the utter ruin of debtors who'd got into trouble. Life had hit them hard, perhaps through a bad harvest or illness. And it stopped them going to the wall. And it stopped society dividing itself up as the rich became ever richer. Now, in practice, the nation did not always follow these guidelines. And you'll find in the book of Amos, Amos hammers at the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of his day, where the rich were getting richer at and exploiting the poor. And you'll find the same in books like Micah and Isaiah for the southern kingdom of Judah. And when that happened, society broke apart, fragmented, became weak, and they were overrun and taken over, and they lost the land. You see, all of this is very sensible. We need rest. We need to respect our resources. We need to respect each other, not exploit each other. And gambling is exploiting each other. Someone wins, it means others lose. Because we need to have a unified society working together for the benefit of all. Oh, what wonderful principles this chapter outlines. And we need to work them into our culture today. These Jubilee principles, 7 days, 7 years, 7 times 7 years, that provided for the needs of all, a break. And even those who were in service, who worked for you, they got the break. Visitors got the break. That alleviated the plight of the poor. Because if you didn't take the harvest, they had a chance of getting something to keep themselves alive. And it benefited the land fertility. But this gave people once in a lifetime a fresh start in life for a family group. Interesting principles, interesting thoughts that we need to ponder in our cultures today. There were conditions attached to holding the land. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws. The boundary conditions and the guidance God had given to his people. And you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit. You will eat your fill and live there safely. Provision of food and security, the basics of life. But they had to live within God's boundary conditions. Now there's a picture of the land. The orange-brown colour, roughly the piece of land that at the peak the nation of Israel possessed. And this stresses it belongs to God. Oh, there are arguments about whose land it is today. These are all wrong. Just follow this logic through. This is what the Old Testament says, and the New Testament confirms it. The land belongs to God. He merely gives it to his people. It's on loan for a purpose. He gave them a secure base where they could live, have homes, have a food supply, and they were secure because God had a purpose for this nation. There was a destiny they had to fulfill. We saw it in previous presentations, the destiny that they were to live beautiful lives and reach out and show God to the people groups round about. And they did this by the quality of their living. a lifestyle to enjoy, and other people would be attracted in. Other people were attracted in, and the nation absorbed many other people. You can see the records all over the place. The nation in some ways failed in their destiny, but in some ways they succeeded brilliantly, because out of that nation came Jesus, who fulfilled the destiny of the people of Israel. But the land belongs to God, and it was given for the task. The task is now completed with the coming of Jesus. There are great principles here that run right throughout the Old and New Testament. Retaining the land is conditional on fulfilling the destiny and living the kind of lives that God said. Follow my decrees and laws in the old language. And when they didn't, they lost it. The task is complete. Jesus has come, and Jesus brings light and life to all people groups throughout the world who will receive him. Looking at a little group of verses, we read this a moment or two. We're to look after others. Someone hits hard times, we don't take advantage, we don't extract interest or profit, we don't take advantage of them and exploit them. But we don't exploit foreigners and strangers in our midst either. A lesson that we need to learn in the West. So important to be there for each other. There was no welfare state, there was no support, there were no mechanisms. And if you look at this passage and many other passages, foreigners, strangers, and the poor are to play a full part of the society. They were not second-class citizens. That is a very, very important principle that we need to grasp. Sadly, in many countries of the world, particularly Islamic states and communist states, those who don't belong are very much second-class citizens and are denied the opportunity to play a full part of the society. That's not the way for the people of God. No exploitation of any form whatsoever. And if that happened, we don't need a welfare state. But the key point is this. If you look at that picture and compare it to what was happening in the other people groups round about, this principle of Leviticus 25 is unique. It's light years ahead of what was going on elsewhere. And indeed it's light years ahead of much that goes on today. But we come to this business of slavery. And we come to this problem of slaves. Slaves within the nation, slaves from beyond the nation. And the problem is, if you read it, we mentally assume a picture of a slave as someone who has got no rights and exploited. And that could happen. But the word in the original doesn't mean that. It's got a much wider range of meanings. And people look at this, particularly people who come up with the old versions of the Bible, which are very misleading. And they condemn the Old Testament as encouraging slavery. But in fact, if you look at the text, that meaning could never be there. Now, much of it is the problem of words. You've got to watch the English translations of the word slave. Now, I strongly advise using a good modern translation because they're based on the best understandings of the original Hebrew. And the modern translations usually capture the meaning extremely well. But watch it, because the word doesn't mean the same. The word can carry anything from a slave in abject poverty, a manservant, a maidservant, or a hired worker. Now, there are other words for maidservants and hired workers. which again the old versions sometimes translate as slave. That's very misleading. It's a totally wrong translation. But the concept was different then in the original languages. So we've got to watch that and get underneath the words to the meaning. The essential meaning is that. Now, someone working for someone else could be a slave in abject poverty. But equally, it could be a trusted maidservant or manservant working about the house. Could be a hired worker working in the fields. To give you an illustration of this, it's used of people who'd given themselves to someone else and who worked for nothing, but that was simply paying off their debts. It's used as someone who was purchased as a slave, who could be a slave, or it could just be a man or a maidservant. But it's equally used the same word of serving God. David is described as a slave of God. Now the translations translate that as serving God correctly. But it's the same word in the Hebrew. Watch language. Don't read backwards. Because the Hebrew word does not carry the same meaning as the English word slave or servant. It's got a wide range of meanings, and only the context shows what is meant. And the modern Bible versions get this pretty well all the time. So we've got to be careful about slavery. If you look at the Old Testament overall, and this is a very quick summary, the forced enslavement of others, no, that's not on. Exploiting or abusing others, no. Selling girls as sex slaves, out, forbidden. If, for example, there's been some sort of war or takeover of something, and someone sees some attractive girls, they have to be treated with respect. There must be a time gap. Marriage is allowed, but it's marriage, permanent. Now these are all very different from what happened in the cultures round about. And the people of Israel had been through slavery and exploitation. They weren't going to put other people through it. And in general, they didn't. But many of the cultures round about, if there was a battle and you won, then you killed all the men who'd been conquered, and you took all the attractive girls and made them your sex slaves, or gave them to your men. That was a normal pattern of the day. Exploiting and abusing others was normal. All of these things are out. But employing others, accepting the work of others to pay off debts, or even if a girl was sold into your possession as a maidservant to pay off a family's debts, you could marry her, but the conditions are laid down. And it's not in this passage, it's elsewhere. Now, all of this is light years ahead of what was going on in the cultures round about. But we've got to interpret it in terms of the culture of the day, which is very different from today. And we've also got to remember that the words in the Hebrew don't carry the exact same meanings as our words in the English today. And again, modern translations usually capture the meaning extremely well. The Jubilee concept runs right throughout the chapter. It was brilliant. And it's something that you need to talk about in your church groups, that the Christian communities of the West, we need to engage with the principles behind this and see how this can work out in practice. There are encouraging signs that some of it is being worked out in practice, in some of the wonderful things that Christians do to support those in need. Ignored by the media, but nonetheless they fit this Jubilee concept. Designed to bring social justice, oh, we long for that. Because it undermined the whole pattern of the few accumulating wealth, which every society ends up doing. But it also strengthens family unity and responsibility for each other within the extended family. Now these make a society strong, both of them, and we lack it today in many ways. But in the days when they had time off, people got together and they focused their life around God. Corporate gatherings, gratitude to God who'd given them the land, who'd rescued them from slavery, who provided for them. But they didn't forget to look after the have-nots. You didn't harvest your field to the edges. You allowed those who were poor to take from your fields in the 1 year in 7. You looked after those who'd had hard times. But there's a moral principle behind all of this. In Leviticus 19, loving one's neighbour as oneself. This is worked out in this chapter in social responsibility, in family unity, the great strong features of society in any culture. And we've got a moral principle there, that our agenda is the best for the other. We put ourselves out to bring benefit, particularly to those in need. But there's one other element in this. It points forward. Jesus, one of the first times he spoke in the synagogue in Nazareth, he quoted from a section in Isaiah chapter 61. And that chapter uses the language of the Jubilee model. And Jesus showed there, when he applied it to himself, that he was fulfilling this Jubilee model. He was the one who brought total release and freedom. So it pointed forward to a greater and better fulfillment in the future. The Jubilee concept has so much to teach us today. Now we can't take this and literalistically apply it into our modern cultures. Our culture today is not based on agriculture. We're not subsistence farmers. Our cultures today are very different. But the principles still apply. And what we've got to do is to sit down in our groups and work out how these principles could be applied within our groups and beyond our groups, and influence society positively for the benefit of all. And there are encouraging signs happening here and there, but we need to move this forward on a much larger scale. The Jubilee principle has so much to teach us today. We're going to move in the next presentation to look at a word, obedience, and see how positive this can be.